Okay, today we will continue with the civilization, and what I will be looking at is mostly examples. So that's the civilization tool, and I think everybody recognize this is the Great War in China. But unfortunately, today we are not talking about China yet. So I chose the wrong picture. Okay, we are looking at some examples. The first one is Egyptian Empire. That's about 3,500 years ago. So the white area is the sea, and the dark blue is the empire. So it is a very large empire at that stage. Is in the North Africa, concentrate along the lower reaches of the Nile River. So we on the right of the screen, you see a yellow river. This river is quite different from the river we found in China, and therefore the culture that developed along the river is quite different. But anyway, the Egyptian obviously depends on this river for their crops, etc. The success of the Egyptian civilization comes partly from its ability to adapt to the conditions of the Nile River. The Nile River has a predictable flooding and controlled irrigation. And because it's predictable, and therefore people can manage the flooding much better, and therefore also manage the irrigation much better. And therefore it produces a lot of surplus food. And we know that with surplus food, then people can start to specialize. And therefore a civilization develops accordingly. And this is also one of the areas where early writing has developed. The area is an arid climate in the northern Africa. This region is distinguished by the Arabian and the Libyan deserts and the River Nile. The Nile is the longest river in the world, flowing northward from the Lake Victoria and eventually emptying into the Mediterranean Sea. The Nile has two main attributes, the blue and the white. This is based on their color. The white Nile is considered to be longer and easier to traverse, but the blue actually carries about 2/3 of the water volume. The name of the attribute comes from the color. So they come together at a place called, I can't pronounce it, and branches again when it reaches Egypt. Because it's this branching, so making the Egypt, the Nile Delta very rich and very fertile. So the Egyptians take advantage of this natural cycle. Because this flooding happened very predictably, the Egyptians were able to develop their agricultural practice around it. The water level of the river rise in August and September, leaving the floodplain and delta submerged in a couple of meters of water at the peak. This yearly flooding of the river is known as inundation. As the floodwater recedes in October, farmers were with well-watered and fertile soil, they can plant their crops accordingly. So it makes it much easier for them to manage their agriculture. Because basically, when they plant, the earth is already saturated with water. So and then by the time they want to harvest, the soil is almost dry. So that makes it very predictable. But whenever it's not a sudden flood, etc., then famine will suffer famines. So normally it's okay, but once every while there will be crisis. To make the best use of the waters, the Egyptians developed system of irrigation. Irrigation allowed the Egyptians to use the Nile's water for a variety of purposes. Notably, irrigation grant them greater control over their agricultural practice. Flood waters were diverted away from certain areas, such as cities and gardens, to keep them from flooding. Irrigation was also used to provide drinking water. Despite the fact that irrigation was crucial to agricultural success, there were no statewide regulations on water control. Rather, irrigation was the responsibility of local farmers. However, the earliest and the most famous reference to the irrigation of Egyptian archaeology has been found on the mace head of the Scobian king, which has been roughly dated to about 3100 BC. So we are looking at around 5,000 years ago. So in one of the pictures, then you will see that the king cutting into ditches. That's agreed. So again, humans started to modify the land to our own use. Will be almost at the beginning of the agricultural revolution. From there onwards, we start changing the landscape continuously. So different culture will change the landscape differently, but irrigation seems to be a common factor. Almost all civilizations somehow have learned to control water, because water is one of the most important elements to sustain life. The technique used in the ancient Egyptian is called basin irrigation. This practice allowed them to control the rise and fall of the river to best suit their agricultural needs. A crisscross network of earthen walls were formed in a few crops that would be flooded by the river. When the floods come, the water would be trapped in the basins formed by the walls. This grid will hold water longer than it would naturally stay, allowing the earth to become fully saturated for later planting. Again, today, a lot of revitalization of dry arid area is based on the same concept. Try to keep the water in the land for as long as possible, and with water there, then plants can survive. Later on, I think I will talk about the Chinese modification of the Laos Plateau. The Laos Plateau is along the Yellow River, and Laos is a very soft soil. So when the rain falls, then the soil will be washed down the river, and that makes Yellow River yellow. The main problem is over this thousand of years of use, the land is almost barren. It's almost all the earth is soaking there, and it cannot trap water. So one of the methods to do that is take horizontal ditches. So it's along the contour, so that when water falls onto the plateau, the water is trapped on these horizontal ditches. So the water is kept on the land for as long as possible, rehydrating the land, and eventually that solve the problem of the Laos Plateau. But we will talk about that sometimes later on when we talk about the Chinese culture. Egyptian society is socially very stratified. The social status was expressly displaced by their different clothing. Farmers make up of the bulk of the population, as usual in almost every early civilization. The lower social status are usually the laborers and the farmers. But agricultural produce was owned directly by state, temple, or noble family that owned the land. So again, these farmers were just laborers, and the produce produced is owned by either the state or the people who own the land. Farmers were also subject to labor tax and were required to work on irrigation and construction projects, etc. So again, I think at the start of our human civilization, slaves and laborers seems to be a common factor as well. Many cultures do use slaves, which today we will consider immoral, but at those times it seems to be quite standard practice. The next level up is artists and craftsmen. They were also under state control, working in shops attached to the temples and paid directly from the state. And then another level up is the scribes and officials, which form the upper class, known as the white kilt class, in reference to the bleached linen garments that serve as a mark of their rank. So you can wear a linen which has been bleached so that it is white. That means you are an upper class. So the upper class predominantly display their social status in art and literature. Below the nobility were the priests, physicians, engineers with special training in their field. It is unclear whether slavery as understood today exists in ancient Egypt. There is difference of opinion among the authors, but I think at those times, slaves seems to be very common across different cultures. So presumably, it might be the case as well. But again, here there's not obvious evidence. But given the farmers, etc., doesn't own the land and the produce belongs to the landowner, so they basically is quite similar to slaves anyway. And in terms of gender balance, the Egyptian view men and women as equal under the law, and even the lowest persons have entitled to petition to the vizier and his court or for redress. Although slaves were mostly used as indentured servants, they were able to buy and sell their servitude, work their way to freedom or nobility, and were usually treated by daughters in the workplace. So it seems that the Egyptian society, although they are strict social status, it seems that they can work their way up. So social mobility is there. Both men and women had the right to own and sell property, make contracts, marry and divorce, receive inheritance, and pursue legal disputes in court. So somehow this gender balance was reversed later in many civilizations and becomes a predominantly male-owned society. But it seems that at the very early stage, men and women are quite equal. Married couples could own property jointly and protect themselves from divorce by agreeing to marriage contracts, which stimulate the financial obligations of the husband to his wife and children should the marriage end. Compared with their counterparts in ancient Greece, Rome, and even more modern places along the world, ancient Egyptian women had a greater range of personal choices, legal rights, and opportunities for achievement. So that was quite interesting to me, at least. The ancient Egyptian had such a balanced gender politics. The legal system is, of course, officially the, is that Pharaoh? Is that how this pronounced? Who was responsible for enacting laws, delivering justice, and maintaining law and order, a concept what ancient Egyptians referred to as, I can't pronounce that word. I don't know how it pronounced.
Mart.
Okay, thank you, Mart.
I think.
Although no legal codes from ancient Egypt survived, court documents show that Egyptian law was based on a common sense view of right and wrong that emphasized reaching agreements and resolving conflicts. rather than strictly adhering to a complicated set of stages. I think that is a good thing. Again, even today, I still think that sometimes laws are made to benefit the rich, at, at least in the common law system that we are in today. Because
Yes.
if you're rich enough to employ lawyers, then you can always take up some kind old law or case which will meet your needs. But if you are poor, you don't have that financial ability to actually do all that research. So again, but again, another interesting thing I think about law is that most people like myself is not versed conversion about laws. We don't exactly know all the details about the law. So the constraint of my behavior, how I act in the public, at least, is not constrained mostly by law. It's rather constrained by my own moral stance. So this emphasis of reaching agreements and view as doesn't come based on a common sense of right and wrong. I think it is based on the moral stance of the people, and that is quite interesting at this stage. So it is not what we would call authoritarian today. It is common sense, I think. And local councils or elders were responsible for ruling in court cases involving small claims and minor disputes. More serious cases involving murder, major land transactions, and tomb robbery was referred to the higher order. I can't pronounce the word Greek. Canbat, is it Canbat?
Yep.
Over which the vizier and the pharaoh preside. Plaintiffs and defendants were expected to represent themselves and were required to swear an oath that they had told the truth. In some cases, the state took on both the role of prosecutor and judge, and it would torture the accused with biddings to obtain a confession and the names of any co-conspirators. Again, this is quite common in almost all Asian legal system that torture was used as a mean of obtaining confession. So that, again, this is not just unique in Greece, I suppose. Trade. The ancient Egyptians engaged in trade with their foreign neighbors to obtain rare, exotic goods not found in Egypt itself. They trade wide and for a very large area. So, for example, they established trade with the Palestine, and then an Egyptian colony station in the southern Canaan dates to slightly before the first dynasty, etc., etc. I think again, humans have been trading or cooperating through trade for as long as we know. Daily life. Most ancient Egyptians were farmers, tied to the land. Their dwellings were restricted to immediate family members and were constructed of mud bricks designed to remain cool in the heat of the day. Each house had a kitchen with an open roof, which contained a grindstone for milling grains and a small oven for baking bread. So again, the food that we expect is very much European style food, bread as being the main consumable, main food. Egyptians has already able to produce a very good ceramics. So they serve to for storage, preparation, transport, consumer good, drink, etc. walls were painted white. I suppose white was considered a very good color at that time. And then the linens can be dyed to white or remove the color. Floors will be covered by reed mats, while wooden stool beds raised from the floor and individual tables comprised the furniture. So it seems that their woodworking is quite good in this sense. The Egyptians place a great value on hygiene and appearance, usually bathed in the Nile and use a soup made from animal fat and chalk. Men shave their entire bodies for cleanliness. Perfumes and aromatic elements cover bad odors and smooth skin. Clothing was made from simple linen sheets, which were pitched white, and both men and women of upper class also wear wigs, jewelry, and cosmetics. So it's quite interesting to me is that they wear wigs. Why? They have hair. Why wear wigs? Okay, children went without clothing until maturity at about 12, and at this stage, males were circumcised. So we know that the traditional circumcision, they much older than I expected. I was thinking it was about the time of Jesus that the circumcision becomes a common practice, but it seems that it is at least 3,000 years old by that time. Of course, women are responsible for taking care of the children while the father provided for the family's income. So it's a very typical family structure. Our family structure that we have a double income is quite recent. Even back in the 70s and 80s, women usually just take care of housework. For example, my mother I don't think she had ever worked for wages. She had always been a housewife. And so the reason idea that women also work to provide income is pretty recent. In terms of military, of course, they will have the military to defend against foreign invasion and for maintaining Egypt's domination in the ancient Near East. The military protect mining expeditions, and there were civil wars. The military was maintaining fortifications along the important trade routes, which is quite similar to today. Military is basically protecting the people as well as protecting the trade. Typical military equipment is bows and arrows, spears, and shield made by stretching animal skin over a wooden flame. And later on, we have weapons and ammos continue to improve after the adaptation of the bronze. With bronze, then you can make much better shields and spears and knives, etc. And the pharaoh was usually depicted in art and literature riding at the head of the army. So it has been suggested that at least a few pharaohs such as Dada and his sons did do so. Okay, so again, it's the strong man leading the country. That's the man who can lead an army, lead the country. Religious belief. Beliefs in divine and in afterlife. So again, there are multiple gods. Gods were not always viewed as benevolent, and the Egyptians believed they had to be appeased. The gods had to appeased with offerings and prayers. The structure of this changed continuously as new deities were promoted in the hierarchy, but the priests made no effort to organize the diverse and sometimes conflicting myths and stories into a coherent system. So there are many contradictions. And there's another interesting idea that I find very interesting. How can, sorry, Jenny, sorry, that's the problem being at home. Sometimes I find it quite interesting that we can hold conflicting ideas in our brains and never challenge that conflicting ideas. Gods, of course, were worshipped. So they were worshipped at different temples and with different offerings and so forth. It seems that different people can believe in whatever gods they like. Common citizens would also worship private statues in their homes. The next culture we are going to look at is Greece. So moving from Egypt to Greece, and then we'll be moving in that direction into the Middle East, and then eventually towards India and China. And then we will also have examples from America as well. It is approximately 1,750 to 1,000 BC. So we are talking about 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. These Greeks introduced several innovations in the fields of engineering, architecture, and military infrastructure, while trade, again, over vast areas of the Mediterranean was essential for their economy. Then somehow it perished with the collapse of the Bronze Age culture in the Eastern Mediterranean, to be followed by the so-called Greek Dark Ages. That period, there's not much records, so we don't know much about it. So that's called the Dark Ages. They are based on palaces. So this is based on a big building in which the ruling family or ruling people will stay, and everything is around the palace. Each of these kingdoms was governed from the palace, which exercised control over most, if not all, industries within its realm. The palatial territory was divided into several sub-regions, each headed by its provincial center. Each province was further divided into smaller districts. A number of palaces and fortifications appear to be part of a wider kingdom. So they are very much in a hierarchy. Moreover, the palace of this region appear to have ruled over a territory 2 to 3 times the size of the other palatial states. So obviously there are some bigger ones, some smaller ones. The contemporary record suggests the presence of a single state under a Greek king. Alternatively, based on archaeological data, some sort of confederation among a number of states appears to be possible. If some kind of united political entity existed, the dominant center was probably located in this area or this area. I can't pronounce the names anyway, with the later state being the most probable center of power. Again, I think with all these centers want to join together in coalitions in order to strengthen their status. So I suppose all these alliances will be formed and break, and then form and break all the time. You track it even earlier, about 6,000 BC. That is the foundation of the Bronze Age culture in Greece. The vast majority of the preserved records deal with administrative issues and give the impression that this Mycenaean Palacio administration was highly systematized, featuring thoroughly consistent language, terminology, tax calculations, and distribution logistics. So this group of people is highly organized. I mean, that's the strength of their existence. The state was ruled by a king, whose role was religious and perhaps also military and judicial. The king, Walnuts, is that Walnuts? Oversaw virtually all aspects of the life, from religious feasting and offerings to distribution of goods, craftsmen, and troops. Under him was the Lawmagitus, whatever, the leader of the people, whose role appears mainly religious. His activities possibly overlap with the king and is usually seen as second in command. Both of them were at the both of them were at the head of a military aristocracy known as the Equata companions. The land possessed by the king is usually the whatever. There is also at least one instance of person who appears titleless in the written record, but whom modern scholars regard probably as a king. So again, all these are there's a lot of guesswork in terms of understanding what happened at that time, because some of the writings is no longer readable to modern day times. A number of local officials positioned by the king appear to be in charge of the district. A council of elders were chaired, and their society referred to the king. There's a lot of name here, which I think for the archaeologists that would be interesting. But for me, I just think that there's a bureaucracy established to rule, but I don't know whether the bureaucracy is based on bloodline or based on ability. That is something I will be interested to know. So in general, their society is divided into groups of free men, the king's entourage, which who also conduct administrative duties, and the common people. These last were watched over by royal agents and were obliged to perform duties for and pay taxes to the palace. Among those who could be found in the palace were well-to-do high officials who probably lived in a vast residence found in proximity to the palace, but also others tied by their work to the palace and not necessarily better off than the members of the higher class, such as craftsmen, farmers, and perhaps merchants, occupying a lower rank in the social ladder of the slaves. So again, slaves were there. So whether there's a mobility of the slaves into other class, I don't know. Sometimes slaves can never move along the social class. The economy is believed it is pre-money. So they will be basically using goods. So the record indicates that the palaces were closely monitoring a variety of industry and commodities, the organization of land management, and the rations given to the dependent personnel. The palace maintained very good record, and that's how we know that at that time they maintained extensive control of no domestic areas of production through careful control, acquisition, and distribution in the palace industry. So it is a top-down management, very much like communists in today's term. And again, as I said, we have examples of how many ships they have. Oh, what behind this? Come on. Okay. Continue. And they also display specialized workforces, and each worker belonged to a precise category and was assigned a specific task in the stage of production, notably in textile. So working together, it seems to be another idea. That's why it had higher economic values. Nevertheless, the palace control over resources appear to have been highly selective in spatial terms and in terms of how different industries were managed. Thus, sectors like the production of perfume, bronze materials were directly monitored from the palace, but the production of ceramics were only indirectly monitored. Regional transactions between the palaces were also recorded on a few occasions. That also remind me of the way the Chinese dynasty has been operating throughout the last couple of thousand years. Um, in China, typically iron ore or the production of iron is tightly controlled because iron ore can be used to make weapons. So that is where the state maintain high control. Another commodity the state usually maintain high control is salts, because we need salts, and therefore you can monopolize essential components. Then the government or the king or emperor will maintain a very good income through your monopoly of a common good. So again, I think the Greece empire or the king also practiced something similar to that. The palace organized their workforce and resources for the construction of large-scale projects in field agriculture industry. Again, the value of this centralized government or centralization of power is the ability to construct large-scale projects. The magnitude of some project indicates that it was the result of combined efforts from multiple palace centers. Most notable of them are the drainage system in the basin, the building of a large dam outside the air, and the drainage of swamp in the valley. So again, it is important for people to get organized in order to make a large scale project. So another notable is the construction of harbors, and that was capable of accommodating large Bronze Age vessels. The economy also featured large-scale manufacturing, as testified by the extent of workshop complexes that have been discovered and largely known to states, being the recent ceramic and hydraulic installations found in the area. So again, the concentration of power by government sometimes is useful in terms of large-scale projects. So I think that is something we can get lessons to. But again, for any large-scale government, corruption and the concentration of power do becomes a issue. Another famous project is, of course, the network of roads. This appear to have been facilitated the speedy deployment of troops. Again, troops deployment, the military has sometimes drive economy because the power centers need to move armies quickly. They might build a road, and that road eventually will be used by the civilians for other purpose. So that is another very interesting development in terms of human civilizations. Sometimes the damage actually becomes a point of growth. The infrastructure engineering seems to be very good at that time and have been limited not to that plane. Trade. Now, by the way, the object here is an earring, a gold earring. The trade over vast areas of the Mediterranean was essential for the economy. These palaces imported raw materials such as metal, ivory, and glass, and exported processed commodities and objects made from those materials, in addition to local products, oil, perfume, wine, wool, and pottery. The international trade at that time was not only conducted by the palace themselves, but also by independent merchants. So quite interesting. Another interesting thing is what kind of material they trade. We know that they trade oil, perfume, wine, wool, pottery, as well as raw material such as metal, ivory, and glass. Another interesting thing is they found traces of opium in one of those ceramic vessels. So yeah, obviously opium is a highly valued goods to be traded. Again, all this trading usually consists of one is necessities such as raw material and products made from the raw material. Another typical case for trading is obviously high value goods. So opium must be considered a high value group at that time. Daily life. The picture on the right is a necklace made out of a ceramic material. The beads and the wire here, I don't know whether it's the original wire, not it probably is a kind of metal wire to thread them together. From observing the wall paintings, sorry, my little dog one, he has been out, so we have to clean him. Okay. Okay, the women wore long dresses and wear jewelry. We don't know why they wear them or why they appear to have significance in the culture, but beads made of something were known to have been worn by women on the bracelet, necklace, and buttons on clothes and other. Yeah, sorry. Seclusion of females from males was common in the household. Again, this is quite different culture compared with the one we last talked about. This time, the women are not as equal as men in the Greek history. Not much is known about women's duties in the house or whether they are different from the duties of men. And through men were involved in warfare and hunting, there's no evidence that suggests women ever took part in either of the two. Women took part in hunting has been up for debate as well. So it is evident that it is a male-dominated society. Architecture. Here is a drawing of a site. We see that there are walls around it, and then in the middle, the large areas probably is the palace, and then the people will live around the palace. This is one of those structure. The best reserve something, and then you we have a chance to visit there. Probably I will be interested to look at these sites and have a bit more understanding of the life at that time. The whole focal point of the social political aspect of the palace was the Megatron, or the throne room. I think where the king or the whoever will be there. It's laid out around a circular heath surrounded by 4 columns. The throne was generally found on the right-hand side upon entering the room, while the interior of the mega room was lavishly decorated, fronting images designed intentionally to demonstrate the political and religious power of the ruler. Access to the marathon was provided through a court, which was reached from a populon. The iconographical of the palace chamber is remarkably uniform throughout Greece. So there is another interesting thing. It seems that they have a common culture, and there is another interesting idea about a culture or a civilization. They all have a common understanding of the reality at that time, and therefore they can work together through that common understanding of how the society works. This is an example of a fortification, massive structure, and we understand it as a defense purpose structure. So this one, I think, is found in the Gia. Is that Gia? Something like that. Is the military is evidence from numerous weapons unearthed, and the use of warrior and combat representations in the contemporary arts and preserved records. They invested in the development of military infrastructure, with military production and logistics being supervised directly from the palace. According to the records in the palace of district, every rural community was obliged to supply a certain number of men who had to serve the army. Similar service was also performed by the aristocracy. So again, compulsory sending of a number of men to serve the army. I think defense is always a common goal. The armies were initially based on heavy infantry, equipped with spears, large shields, and in some occasion armor. Later in the 30th century, the warfare underwent major changes both in tactics and weaponry, and armed units become more uniform and flexible, while weapons become smaller and lighter. The spear remained the main weapon, while the sword played a secondary role in combat. Other offensive weapons include bows, maces, axes, slings, and javelins. The precise role and distribution of the chariots on the battlefield is a matter of dispute again, because lack of evidence. It appears that chariots were initially used as fighting vehicles during the 16th to 14th centuries BC, while later in the 13th BC, their role was limited to transportation. So I think the military tactics also depends on the response from the other party. So they have to adapt to the warfare. Again, collapse. The reason for collapse is not completely understood. We don't know why it collapsed, but we do know that in around 1200 to 1000 BC, then you had a preliminary collapse, and that later collapse also had happened. It appears to have prompted the massive strengthening and the expansion of fortification. And in some cases, arrangements were made for creation of subterranean passages which lead to underground siphons. So again, it is possibly due to an invasion by another tribes. And therefore, when there's invasions, then the kingdom might have overstretched its resources. None of the defensive measures appear to have prevented the final destruction and collapse of the state. A second destruction between 1190 BC or shortly after. The event marked the end of this civilization as a major power. The site was then reoccupied on a smaller scale, and then another civilizations established on top of it. So again, a place where a civilization can happen a couple of times, and then with a period where human almost gone from that region, is a recurring theme in a lot of Middle East and Northern African sites. But interestingly, in our Asian parts, in China, in India, it doesn't seem to be the case. When a civilization collapses, then it almost seems immediately it will be occupied by another civilization. So the land has been continuously being used. Whereas in Africa and the Middle East, sometimes the sites can be left to nature for a very long time before humans return to there to establish another civilization. So what is the reason of that? I don't know. Probably something I would like to investigate. As a result of this turmoil, specific regions in the mainland Greece witnessed a dramatic population decrease, and people migrate away, and the other regions on the edge will then prospered, and then eventually it will come back, and sometimes it seems another area can avoid a destruction, whereas some can't. So the specific of whether a civilization can sustain something, I think depends a lot of opportunity and chance. At the present, there's no satisfactory explanation for the collapse of the palace system. The two most common theories is a population movement, an internal conflict. The first attributes the destruction to invaders. So there is a hypothesis of a certain invasion, and that invasion occurred, and then in that we can see from the archaeology data that a new type of ceramic also appear, and therefore the civilization has been taken over by another civilizations. And during that time, the previous civilization will sustain widespread destruction. So that is one possibility. Another scenario is internal disturbances, which lead to internal warfare among the different palaces or states. And this results in, again, destruction as a result of strict hierarchical social system and ideology of the king. In general, due to the scale archaeological picture, there is a continuing controversy among scholars over whether the improvised societies that succeeded the palace state were newcomers or population which already there but changed their daily lives in order to adapt to the new situation. Tend to prefer the later scenario. Okay. Additional theory involve climate change, drought, earthquakes, etc., making a large-scale damage to the livelihood of the area, and therefore it cannot sustain itself and eventually collapsed. Okay, that's it for the presentation. Any question?
Just one thing, in the Egyptian, I thought it was interesting that in the Egyptian civilization, men and women were considered equal, etc.
Yeah.
Whereas I think I'm right in saying in that general sort of area now, it's more men are, dominant over women. Yeah. Women don't have many rights and whatever. It's funny how long ago it was, a good balance, and now it's not.
I think one of the interesting is the religion. Religion play a very significant role in determining the relationship between men and women. For example, in the Muslim world, the women's position is very much diminished.
Yeah.
In the Christian world, is better, but it's still a little bit diminished. But in a strict society, in a atheist society like China today, men and women are quite equal. So I will again, there's also other factors as well, not only religion, but I think religion do play a very important role. It depends. It depends on the kind of religion that they believe in. I think.
Well, I said before, religion's got a lot to answer for.
Yeah.
Over the years.
But anyway, at the moment, the world is still very much divided along religious lines.
Yeah.
The Christian world, the Muslim world seems to be in conflict all the time. And even in the Muslim world, they are divided along their different, is that called cults? But I think same for the Christian world. So we have the Catholics and the Protestants. So religion is a way of dividing people into different groups.
Yep.
And the relationship men and women are different in terms of our body abilities. Women have to bear child, and for human, the children need a couple of years to grow up. Maybe some people say before 30, you are still not grow up yet. So it takes, and therefore men and women do take different roles because of these natural differences. But for social status, I think that is very much depends on whether the religion or the culture allow more equal. But quite interesting in that even 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago, we see examples of very much equal rights between the gender as well as unequal. Very much, I think humans are just similar.
We don't sort of remember the Egyptians much for science, do we? For mathematics or astronomy and stuff, but the Greeks do.
I will be looking at science and technology independently because there is some area I'm very interested in. So I will be looking at, for example, the development of mathematics and the contribution by different cultures.
Yeah, okay.
Similar for science and then similar to transportation and so forth. I will, after talking about civilization, I will switch over to talk about all kinds of human inventions.
Okay, good.
Okay, I think we have to cross over to China today.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.